Mortal Engines, Part 1, Chapter 8, The Trading Cluster. Tom was dreaming of Catherine. She was walking, arm in arm with him, through the familiar rooms of the museum. Only, there were no curators or guildsmen about, nobody to say, "Polish the floor, Natsworthy," or "Dust the 43rd century glassware." He was showing her around the place as if he owned it, and she was smiling at him as he explained the details of the replica airships and the great cutaway model of London. Through it all, a strange moaning sounded, and it wasn't until they reached the National History Gallery that they realised it was the blue whale singing to them. The dream faded, but the weird notes of the whale's song lingered. He was lying on a quivering wooden deck. Wooden walls rose on either side, with morning sunlight glinting through the gaps between the planks. And overhead, a mad confusion of pipes and ducts and tubes crawled over the ceiling. It was Speedwell's plumbing, and its burblings and grumbles were what he had mistaken for the song of the whale. He rolled over and looked around the tiny room. Hester was sitting against the far wall. She nodded when she saw that he was awake.
Where am I?"
he groaned.
"I didn't know anybody really said that," she said. "I thought that was just in books. Where am I? How interesting."
No, really," Tom protested, looking around at the rough walls and the narrow metal door. "Is this still Speedwell? What happened?"
"The food, of course," she replied.
"You mean Raileen drugged us? But why?" He got up and made his way to the door across the pitching deck. "Don't bother," Hester warned him. "It's locked." He tried it anyway. She was right. Next, he stumbled over to peer through a crack in the wall. Beyond it, he could see a narrow wooden walkway that flickered like a goggle screen picture as the shadow of one of Speedwell's wheels flashed across it. The out-country was rushing past, looking much rockier and steeper than when he last saw it. "We've been heading south by southeast since first light," explained Hester wearily before he could ask. "Probably longer, but I was asleep too." "Where are they taking us?" "How should I know?" Tom sat down in a heap with his back to the shuddering wall. "That's it then," he said. "London must be hundreds of miles away. I'll never get home now." Hester said nothing. Her face was white, making the scars stand out even more than usual, and the blood had soaked into the planking around her injured leg. An hour crawled by, and then another. Sometimes people went hurrying along the walkway outside, their shadows blocking out the skinny shafts of sunlight. The plumbing burbled to itself. At last, Tom heard the sound of a padlock being undone. A hatch low down on the door popped open, and a face peered in. "Everybody all right?" "All right?" shouted Tom. "Of course we're not all right." He scrambled towards the door. Raileen was on hands and knees outside, crouching down so he could see through the hatch, which Tom suspected was really a cat flap. Behind him were the booted feet of some of his men standing guard. "What have you done this for?" Tom asked. "We haven't done you any harm." The old mare looked embarrassed. "That's true, dear boy, but times are hard, you see. Cruel hard these days. No fun running a traction town. We have to take what we can get, so we took you. We're going to sell you as slaves, you see. That's how it is. There'll be some slaving towns at the cluster, and we're going to sell you. It has to be done. We need spare parts for our engines if we're to keep a step ahead of the bigger towns." "Sell us?" Tom had heard of cities that used slaves to work the engine rooms, but it had always seemed like something distant and exotic that would never affect him. "I've got to catch London. You can't sell me." "Oh, I'm sure you'll fetch a good price," Raileen said, as if it were something Tom should be pleased about. "A handsome, healthy lad like you will make sure you go to a good owner. I don't know about your friend, of course. She looks half dead and she was no oil painting to start with. But maybe we can sell you off together. Buy one, get one free sort of thing." He pushed 2 bowls through the flap, round metal bowls such as a dog would eat from. One contained water, the other more of the bluish algae. "Eat up," he said cheerfully. "We want you looking nice and well fed for the auction. We'll be at the cluster by sundown, and we sell you in the morning." "But," Tom protested. "Yes, I know, and I'm terribly sorry about it. But what can I do?" said Raileen sadly. "Times are hard, you know." The hatch slammed shut. "What about my CD?" shouted Tom. There was no answer. He heard Rayleen's voice in the passage outside, talking to the guard. Then, nothing. He cupped his hands and drank some water, then took the bowl across to Hester. "We've got to get away," he told her. "How?" Tom looked around their cell. The door was no use, locked and guarded as it was. He peered up at the plumbing until he had a crick in his neck. But although some of the pipes looked big enough for a person to crawl through, he could see no way to get into them, or even to reach them. Anyway, he wouldn't have fancied crawling through whatever the thick fluid was which he could hear gurgling inside them. He turned his attention to the wall, feeling his way along the planks. At last, he found one that felt slightly loose, and gradually, as he worked at it, it started to get looser still. It was slow, hard, painful work. Tom's fingers filled with splinters and the sweat ran down his face, and he had to stop each time someone passed along the walkway outside. Hester watched, silently, until he started to feel cross with her for not helping. But, by evening, as the sky outside turned red and the racing townlet started to slow, he had made a gap just wide enough to get his head through. He waited until he was sure there was no one about. Then he leaned out. Speedwell was passing through the shadows of some tall spines of rock, the town gnawed cores of old mountains. Ahead lay a natural amphitheatre, a shallow bowl between more rock spires, and it was full of towns. Tom had never seen so many trading suburbs and traction villages gathered in one place before. "We're here," he told Hester. "It's the trading cluster." Speedwell slowed and slowed, manoeuvring into a space between a ragged little sail-powered village and a large market town. Tom could hear the people on the new towns hailing Speedwell, asking where it had come from and what it had to trade. "Scrap metal," he heard Mrs. Raileen bellow back. "And some wood and a pretty CD and 2 fine, fresh, healthy young slaves." "Oh, quirk," muttered Tom, working away at enlarging the hole he had made. "It'll never be big enough," said Hester, who always expected the worst and was usually right. "You could try helping instead of just sitting there," Tom snapped back, but he regretted it at once, for he could see that she was very ill. He wondered what would happen if she was too weak to escape. He couldn't run off into the out-country alone and leave her here. But if he stayed, he would end up as a slave on one of these filthy little towns. He tried not to think about it, and concentrated on making the hole bigger, while the sky outside grew dark and the moon rose. He could hear music and laughter drifting across the trading cluster, and the sounds of gangways being run out, as some of Rayleen's people went off to enjoy themselves aboard the other towns. He scrabbled and scratched at the hole, prizing at the planks, scraping at them with a rusty nail, but it was no use. At last, desperate, he turned to Hester and hissed, "Please, help!" The girl stood up unsteadily and walked over to where he crouched. She looked sick, but not quite as bad as he'd feared. Perhaps she had been saving herself, harbouring her last reserves of strength until it was dark enough to escape. She felt around the edges of the hole he had made and nodded. Then, leaning all her weight on Tom's shoulder, she swung her good foot up hard against the wall. Once, twice, she kicked it, the wood around the hole splintering and yielding, and at the third kick, a whole section of planking fell out, spilling across the walkway outside. "I could have done that," said Tom, staring at the ragged hole and wondering why he hadn't thought of it. "But you didn't, did you?" said Hester, and tried to smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile. An ugly, crooked thing, but very welcome. It made him feel that she was starting to like him and didn't just regard him as an annoyance. "Come on then," she said, "if you're coming." Hundreds of miles away, across the moonlit mud, Shrike spots something. He signals to the engineer pilots, who nod and grumble as they steer the Goshawk 90 down to land. What now? How much longer are we going to keep flying back and forth along these track marks before he'll admit the kids are dead? But they grumble quietly. They are terrified of Shrike. The hatch opens and Shrike stalks out. His green eyes sweep from side to side until he finds what he is looking for. A rag of white fabric from a torn shirt, soggy with the rain, half buried in the mud. "Hester Shaw was here," he tells the outcountry at large, and begins sniffing for her scent.